What's up everybody, Commander Sanctum here, and today we have a brand new deck tech using Storm, Force of Nature. Storm is a 3/4 mutant hero for 1 green-blue-red that has flying, vigilance, and whenever Storm deals combat damage to a player, the next instant or sorcery spell you cast has Storm. As soon as Storm was spoiled, the very first card I thought of was Dragonstorm. Dragonstorm is a card I've loved ever since I first saw it played in the 2007 World Championships, and it's something that I've always wanted to make into a Commander deck. While Dragonstorm does already have Storm, giving it additional copies of Storm with Storm's ability would be an absolutely wild play and something that immediately appeals to me. I mean really, who doesn't want a Dragonstorm that has Storm? This deck tech will focus primarily on trying to achieve this and cast Dragonstorm with a decently high Storm count to bring in a ton of dragons onto the battlefield. And while giving Dragonstorm Storm is the dream of the deck, it'd be pretty janky if that's all it did. So we'll also make sure we can simply cast Dragonstorm normally, or even the dragons themselves to try to make it a bit more consistent. With that, buckle up, this is going to be one heck of a deck tech. The first thing we need for this to work is, of course, dragons. Anyone who's ever casted and resolved a Dragonstorm before knows that as soon as you do, you're very likely going to be the primary target. So what we want is dragons that enter and do something immediately so we can actually get value out of them. The best way to do this is with Enter the Battlefield effects. With that, we have Terror of the Peaks and Scourge of Vulcus, both of which do damage whenever dragons enter the battlefield. We also have Lathless that, whenever another non-token dragon enters, you create a 5/5 dragon token. Honestly, if you're able to Dragonstorm for 3, bringing out these 3 cards would probably be a pretty good idea since you could do a ton of damage plus get a large board pretty much immediately. Next up we have Cloth Unrivaled Ancient and Leyline Tyrant, both of which make it so that specific mana is not lost as steps and phases end. Now this is very important since Dragonstorm is a 9 mana costed spell. This allows us, at least with Leyline Tyrant, to cast rituals in our first main phase, and then attack and keep that mana from the rituals to use in the second main phase for a Dragonstorm. Now Cloth says only the mana it generates, but if we have a large board, this could still be quite a bit of mana after an attack, making this a very powerful and useful effect to make sure we can cast that Dragonstorm at the second main phase. Next up we have a trio of dragons that all generate us treasure in Goldspan Dragon, Old Gnawbone, and Ganax Astral Hunter. Again, since Dragonstorm is 9 mana, having those extra treasures after an attack or when dragons enter would be very useful to make sure we can cast it. Not to mention, it'll just make it easier for us to cast the dragons normally in case we need to do that without a Dragonstorm present. Finally, we have some dragons that are just good utility. Dragonlord Atarka is great because it allows you to ping off your opponent's creatures or even planeswalkers, which may be crucial against some decks. Dragon Broodmother is a good fodder generator, allowing you to amass an army of flying creatures quickly. Not to mention, they're dragons, which synergize very nicely with other cards like the Scourge of Vulcus. Miriam Sentinel Worm is likely just one of the best dragons out there, and definitely the best one we have access to, as it'll make token copies of your other dragons. If you Dragonstorm out a Miriam, she'll end up making tokens of each other dragon that was stormed out, giving you extreme value no matter what dragons you choose. To make sure we can actually cast Dragonstorm and our other more heavily costed dragons, we have access to a number of ritual effects, that is, spells that generate you more mana than you use to cast it. For this we have the common trifecta of Pyretic Ritual, Seething Song, and Desperate Ritual, which can be used not only to provide you with extra mana to cast the Dragonstorm or other dragons, but also give you a nice storm count if chained together. We also have access to Mana Geyser, which is pretty much one of the best red spells in Commander in general, and Ironcrag Feed, which will give you a surplus of red mana, but will make it so you can only cast one more spell on that turn. It's important to remember with these ritual effects that, under normal circumstances, mana is removed from the mana pool as steps and phases end, meaning if you cast these in your first main phase and go to combat, any leftover mana will be lost. That being said, just because the deck's goal is to cast a Dragonstorm after hitting with Storm, doesn't mean that's the only thing you can do. If you can get Storm's ability to trigger and cast a Mana Geyser as your Stormed spell, you'll still generate a ton of mana to either cast a normal Dragonstorm or even dump a bunch of dragons from your hand. Speaking of mana emptying from mana pools, we have a few spells that will allow us to keep that mana instead. These effects are what I like to call mana batteries, as they allow you to effectively store unused mana for later use, which would be very useful for us when our goal is to cast a 9 mana spell. Krufik's God of Horizons and his stone, Horizon Stone, are two of the best ways to do this, turning unused mana into colorless mana instead. There are a few other cards that have a similar ability, but I opted for these two specifically, mostly because they're harder to remove than some of the other options. Why not include them all? Well, while this is a powerful effect, we can't get too hung up in making sure we can cast a Dragonstorm with Storm's ability on it, as it'll make the deck too inconsistent if we try. So having these plus the dragons with the similar effect seems like a good way to get this effect without overdoing it. Since one of the main goals of this deck is to cast a Dragonstorm, we need to make sure we can consistently get it out of our library. The best way to do this is with tutors. Mystical Tutor and Solve the Equation will both allow you to search for an instant or sorcery card out of your library and either put it on top or put it in your hand. These cards can even come in clutch with other instants and sorceries as well. Need more lands? Search up a ramp spell. Need more cards? Get a card draw spell out of your deck. Pairing either of those with Storm's ability can get you extreme card advantage, so make sure to keep that in mind when tutoring as well. In order to get Storm's ability to trigger, she needs to be able to do combat damage to an opponent. While she does have some evasion already with flying, it would be good to make sure she can consistently get through, even if your opponents have a ton of flying or reach on the battlefield. This can be achieved with Trailblazer Boots or Brotherhood Regalia, which either give non-basic landwalk or unblockable, respectively. Brotherhood Regalia even doubles as a pseudo protection ability for Storm, as it gives her ward 2, making her more difficult to spot remove. One big downside with Dragonstorm is that it can basically turn your board from empty to the most powerful in the game at the snap of a finger. With Storm's ability triggering after combat, this makes it even more likely that achieving the goal in this deck will result in an immediate board wipe with minimal impact from your dragons. To help prevent this, we need some protection spells that will let our dragons survive until our next turn. Heroic Intervention is great board wipe protection, as it allows us to keep our creatures while likely wiping all of our opponents out. An Offer You Can't Refuse and Swansong are great and cost-effective counterspells. It's very important in this deck to save these counterspells for board wipes, as your opponents are almost assuredly going to try once you resolve the Dragonstorm. Card draw is always an important facet of a commander deck, and we have a few that work very well with our theme of dragons and Storm. Temur Ascendancy will trigger off of pretty much all of our creatures, since dragons are a generally high-powered creature type. It also gives our creatures haste, meaning if we resolve a first main phase Dragonstorm, we can immediately attack with the dragons we search up and can impact the board before a board wipe. Archmage Emeritus is an absolute bomb card draw engine with Storm. Since Storm copies the spell, each stormed out spell will also trigger Magecraft on the Archmage, since it cares about cast or copy. Growth Spiral is a cheap card draw and ramp spell all in one, and honestly, makes for an excellent target with Storm's ability if you need to quickly get a card or land advantage over your opponents. Finally, we have some good utility cards that will help us with our strategy. Urza's Incubator is a great way to make our generally expensive dragons cheaper to cast. Again, Dragonstorm may be the primary goal of the deck, but there's pretty much always going to be situations where we need to manually cast our dragons, so the Incubator is a good way to go about this. Quicken is a little bit of tech that I really enjoy, as this will let us cast our Dragonstorm on an opponent's turn if we want to, while also even replacing itself by drawing a card. The most important thing to remember about Storm is that it doesn't just count the spells you've cast in a turn, but everyone. Meaning if you cast Quicken into a Dragonstorm on an opponent's turn after they've cast 2 spells, you'll have a Storm count of 3 instead of just 1. Here is an example deck list utilizing all the previously mentioned cards. Additional cards include, of course, more dragons, a number of ramp spells to make sure we can generate enough mana to cast our bigger spells, and a number of card draw. I want to point out the card draw choices. I opted, pun intended, to go with a lot of the 1 mana spells, as they'll help contribute to our Storm count and are great things to cast in a first main phase before we hit with Storm and follow up with the Dragonstorm. Brainstorm in particular is actually very good in this deck, as it'll let us put any dragons in our hand back into our library, in case we want to get them out with the Dragonstorm cast. This is a deck that, I think, when it works, will be one of the absolute coolest things ever, but kind of requires the stars to align to get there. There are so many moving pieces in this deck, between what dragons will be effective in any given scenario, making sure Storm can hit consistently, having enough mana to cast a Dragonstorm, while also making sure you have a good Storm count. There's just so many facets to this deck and so many areas where it can go wrong. This was honestly one of the tougher deck builds I've done, and still will likely require a good amount of tuning to do that can only come with repetitions of actually playing the deck. All that being said, this is one of those decks that I absolutely want to work, and will do whatever I can to make it work. Dragonstorm is such a cool and unique card, and being able to give it multiple instances of Storm, I mean, come on, that's pretty much one of those experiences that you'll never forget. Kind of like killing someone with a door to nothingness, another thing I enjoy greatly doing. Honestly, I can't wait to get in some games with this deck, and I'd implore all of you to do the same. If you do, and you find good ways to tune it to make it more efficient or consistent, please let me know. I'd love to see what changes you make or what deck lists you come up with to achieve this really cool concept. I hope you enjoyed watching this deck tech on Storm, Force of Nature. The full deck list outlined in this video can be found at the Architect link at the top of the description. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to drop a like and comment, as well as subscribe to the channel for more Magic content. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.